This show is a member of the Sorgatron Media Podcast Network. Find out more at sorgatronmedia.com. This show is brought to you by IndyWrestling.us. Check out IWC, RWA, and more. And listeners like you, support this show at patreon.com/Wrestling Mayhem Show.
Hungry as fuck, but I ain't starving yet. Chain for the pain, cocktail bar set. Never said I was a gangster or thug, but I'm an animal. Feeding for the taste of the floor.
Hey guys, it is the Indy Mayhem Show. I'm Mike Sorg at Sorgatron on the Twitter here in the Sorgatron Medios in Pittsburgh, PA, and looking to have a fun night talking about podcasting in professional wrestling, amongst other things. Again, please check out everything at IndyWrestling.us as well as WrestlingMayhemShow.com, where you can find this and other great podcasts, and also on IndyWrestling.us and the Indy Wrestling Network. A lot of the people that we talk with on the show are featured there on VOD, DVD, the network subscription, and all kinds of places. And tonight's guest is no different. And please, if you have any suggestions, we're ramping up and looking at our calendars, figuring out who we're going to have on the show over the next month in February. If you have any ideas for you think we should be talking to, because there's way too much wrestling for any of us to watch, and we'd love to hear who you think we should definitely have the show. Maybe we're missing out on, or if you have questions for anybody we have announced in a future edition of this show, please hit us up. Good times at WrestlingMayhemShow.com on the email on 412-206-WMS0. So this week, I'm excited, and I know I've been kind of saying for a while, I was like, listen, I'm going to have this guest on the show, and I just want to talk about podcasting, because I'm excited that he's got a podcast on, and I think at one point I was at a bar with him a couple of months ago in Erie, and drove home and said, oh, I wanted to say he should have a podcast, and then I found out he was starting his podcast like that week. So Gregory Iron joining us this week from Texas, usually a Cleveland boy. How you doing?
I'm okay. How are you?
All right. I see. Obviously, the podcasting has lavished you with all this traveling now, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, like wrestling in general is giving me the traveling schedule more than ever before the last couple years. But with the added incentive of the podcast now, you know, there's more reason to get out there and then make contacts and see who's going to be on the shows that I'm going to be on, and then harass them to do a podcast with me. So it's an adventure.
That's gotta be fun. So let's start at the beginning of this. Usually I start the show with like, how did you get into wrestling? But for you, I kind of want to find out, how did you get into the podcasting side? What kind of was your first glimmer of like, hey, I need to do a podcast on my side?
Well, you know, if you go back in time for me, if anyone's heard any portion of my story, obviously, you know that I'm a pro wrestler with cerebral palsy. And so obviously, we fast forward from 2006, when I'm thinking about being a wrestler, to now. You realize that I've been pro wrestling for 14 years, and that's something that no one thought could happen at all. So initially, being so passionate about wrestling like I was when I was a kid, I never thought I was going to be a professional wrestler. I started looking towards broadcasting, and I always saw myself as being maybe like the next Jim Ross or Jerry Lawler or something. And so I thought wrestling announcers like memorize statistics and facts, because, you know, why would they have a piece of paper in front of them, right? They just have to know all these useless facts. So especially because I love WWE, I became like an encyclopedia, a walking encyclopedia for WWE. And so to this day, pretty much until you get to about 2006, it gets a little blurry when I begin wrestling, but I could tell you the most useless WWE product knowledge possible, because I just committed it to memory. It's really psychotic. Like on my podcast for my Patreon, we just did a bonus episode about the Royal Rumble, and I told my co-host Aaron Bauer, I'm pretty sure I can name every Royal Rumble winner in order. And I'm not going to spoil it for you, but the amount that I got in a row from 1988 until 2019 is pretty pathetic. So laying the groundwork with that, I initially went to college for communications, and I only lasted a semester before I got the bug for wrestling. And you know, I didn't go to a specific college for broadcasting, which maybe in retrospect that would have been better for me, because I went to a community college, and I didn't like the idea that I had to learn other stuff too, like advanced math that would bear no help with me in regards of like doing radio, or television, whatever it was that I was going to get into. So I had started going to indie shows, and then I started training. So there's kind of this gap of doing any type of communications from the time I became a wrestler, right? So it wasn't until a couple of years ago when I did Stone Cold Steve Austin's podcast, and for the first time in my life, my useless WWE knowledge came in great handy, because after we did an episode about my story, so Stone Cold asked me if I wanted to hang around, and he's like, "You want to hang around for a little bit? What are you doing for today? Want to do another podcast? Just talk about our favorite matches, talk about our favorite wrestlers?" And I'm thinking to myself, no, Stone Cold Steve Austin, why would I want to do that? And I'm like, of course I want to hang out and talk wrestling with Stone Cold Steve Austin. And so that gave me the opportunity to sit there, and I don't want to say flaunt my knowledge, but I was able to because some of my favorite matches involve Stone Cold Steve Austin. I mean, like if Hulk Hogan was my favorite as a kid, Stone Cold was my favorite as an angsty teenager trying to figure out who I was and like rebelling against the man. So I was able to set Steve up for his own stories. And after the fact, we stayed in contact. We're still in contact to this day. And the feedback that he had got from the podcast was a lot of people were saying that they could see me having a podcast of my own. And when he initially told me, like, do you think you would want to do a podcast? I said, I don't know. The market's so oversaturated. Everybody has a podcast. You buy a microphone, you have a podcast. I don't know if I want to do it. But he had put that idea in my head. And then last year, for the first time, I quit my 9-to-5 job, and I solely started focusing on wrestling and motivational speaking. And thanks to an investor, someone invested in some decent podcasting equipment for me because they knew the Stone Cold story. And they said, why don't you give this podcasting thing a shot? And that's pretty much how it began. So starting in September, I started to figure out the process, and I launched my own podcast. And it's been, trial and error, but I think I'm getting the hang of it.
Yeah, it is. It was really nice to see when this launched out. First of all, you mentioned Aaron. I remember Aaron from going up there and shooting some Prime Wrestling with you guys up in the Cleveland area. So it's good to hear from him, because I haven't heard from him in several years being down here in Pittsburgh, including hearing some knowledge about Black Diamond that we film now about the rats or in the pyro and such. But that was a fun discovery. So one thing I know a podcast is catching fire a little bit when every time I catch up with, we're filming shows every weekend, and when one of my camera guys is like, did you hear what happened on this podcast? And yours was coming up a lot. I don't know, just because we're kind of localized and run in some similar circles here. But you definitely, like, people were talking about it and what you're doing, and you it's not just an interview podcast. It's not just an Art of Wrestling clone or anything like that. Like, you're kind of digging into different things and developing segments that I don't see too many indie wrestlers in your position doing.
Yeah, I didn't want it to be the same as everyone else. Like, and if you go back and listen to the pilot episode 0, which I didn't realize until I think a week before that I needed to put out a test episode to even get the RSS feed up and running. So like that was scary and like put me at my wit's end. But if you go back and listen to that, I was kind of talking to myself and just kind of getting an idea of like what the podcast might be. I knew there was going to be an interview format to it, but I knew I wanted it to be something more. And I said this on a couple other podcasts. Colt Cabana's podcast was very popular amongst fans and wrestlers based on his interview format. And I think when he changed his format a couple years ago and stopped doing the interviews, I think that left a lot of people disappointed. And I don't want to say that I want to be the guy to fill Cabana's shoes, because those are big shoes to fill. And I think in a lot of ways, not just in podcasting, but in wrestling in general, Colt laid the groundwork for a lot of guys in the industry on the independent level to make a living at this over the last 5 to 10 years. And we can never pay him back for that. But in my head, I wanted to at least give the idea of doing an interview form podcast a shot, especially because now there's younger guys coming around that maybe never got a shot on Cabana's podcast like I did, that maybe, I don't know if my interview style works out, that I can maybe shine some light and give them a little bit of a rub on the podcast. And but on top of that, I knew the podcast would be a way for me to tell stories that I tell in cars and tell amongst my friends that I might not necessarily get to tell in interviews of my own that like have kind of been hidden for the last 13 or 14 years that I've been in wrestling. Like, for example, one of the things we talk about this week on the podcast is a group of guys that we were forced to book in Pro Wrestling Ohio, referred to as Wally's Elite, which essentially was the promoter Wally, because he doesn't understand the difference between good and bad wrestling. He would throw these guys a bone that might not necessarily deserve an opportunity on TV. And they had always been an inside joke behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
But now that I have this format, like no one's ever going to ask me, so who are the worst wrestlers you've ever been on shows with that no one's ever heard of? But now that I have my own podcast, I can kind of bring these characters to the forefront that people might not know about otherwise. Like if anyone's been following the podcast, one of the biggest characters on the show, he was a real life guy. And I don't know if you ever came across him in your travels, Sorg. There was a guy that I heard legend about named Animal Steel. And his deal was he looked like George the Animal Steel. So they would bill him as Animal Steel on posters back in the 90s, mainly throughout Ohio, but I think also in Michigan. Now, his deal was his name was Howard Animal Steel. So you wouldn't find that out until, Showtime or whatever. Or in some cases, he's just billed as Animal Steel, and people would approach him at the gimmick table as if he was the WWE Hall of Famer, right? And it became such a legend that when he ended up passing away, this Howard Steel character, people thought the real George the Animal Steel died, and it became like a news story in the Ohio area, because I believe this Animal Steel was born in like Lorain, Ohio. So even to this day, even after the real George Steel has passed away, people always lay claim to this Animal Steel, Howard Animal Steel, dying back in like 2005 and saying, it's such a shame that one of our own died, this huge wrestling legend. And it's just like things like that. People have never heard those stories. And so I want to be able to tell those stories. And I think it offers too, a side of my sense of humor that sometimes I just can't display in a pro wrestling ring. And I think Aaron Bauer has been the perfect co-host. I think he's been one of the most underrated minds in professional wrestling. Obviously, he was based primarily out of the Midwest, but he was promoting shows and sort of wrestling and managing and commentating over the last 20 years. And his voice has been in the background of some of the biggest names in the history of independent wrestling that have gone on to do bigger and better things, like Johnny Gargano or, a host of girls from the AIW shows. I mean, EC3, you name anybody from AIW, chances are Aaron's voice has been behind, basically added the lyrics to the music that they were playing in the ring. So I just think he's a perfect co-host. And we're just trying to bring new and untold stories to light, and I'm having fun doing it.
Awesome. And you mentioned like a lot of the background communications and everything. Like I always recall when I was helping with the Chair Shot reality show for a summer, when they're doing on locations, doing a show with you. We may have talked about this last time you were on. I just remember it stuck in my head. I think you had an LJN figure Hulk Hogan for some reason. And we were talking about how you were trying to get into writing and kind of diversify a little bit. And that's why when I last saw you in Erie, it's just like, oh, hey, he should do a podcast, because that came to me. So this is kind of that extension of that conversation we had all those years ago.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too where I've always been a fan of writing, and it's just one of those things where, again, I didn't think I would be a wrestler, but lo and behold, I became a wrestler. So some of those other, I guess, artistic fulfillments that I got with wrestling, kind of driving, kind of fell to the wayside. And as I've progressed as a wrestler and I became more realistic about things, I decided to focus more of my passion on the things like writing and stuff, just to see, like, there's more than one way to take your passion and parlay it into the business aspect of making money in the wrestling, right? Like when I started wrestling, the goal and the dream was, one day I'm going to go to WWE and hopefully make some money and not even get rich. Getting rich was never the goal. It was just to live comfortably. And I think in a lot of ways, as I've grown up in the wrestling industry, it still is the goal. But now more so than ever, my mind is more on terms of like, you know what, I would love to go to WWE. I would love to be there with my best friend, Johnny Gargano, or one of my closest friends in the world, Vic Joseph, and be sharing laughs and stories with them on the road for the same company. But that might not ever happen. And even if it doesn't, that's okay. And so I'm focusing my mindset towards things like the writing and the broadcasting aspect as well as wrestling, because again, I feel like there's so many ways that if you have a passion for this business, and just because you don't get the spotlight on you in one way, like I do think that if I never get signed to a major contract, I guess it would be a lost opportunity, I think, in a lot of ways, because I do think I could do a lot of good for not just the developmentally disabled community, but for wrestling fans and people outside of wrestling as a whole, to see someone who is undersized and had been bullied his whole life and had the odds against him to overcome the odds. Like, I think there's money left on the table if that never happens. But I'm a logical person, and again, I'm passionate about wrestling. So as long as I can make a living somehow in the realm of wrestling, I'm okay with that. And that's why, when I started doing things with Justin LaBar, I think I started doing that almost 10 years ago. Yeah. Just a little bit more writing on the side. And behind the scenes, what people never realized was pretty much from the day that I started in wrestling, because of my connection with Johnny and the connection with Pro Wrestling Ohio and Prime Wrestling, I was doing a lot of the writing behind the scenes for the TV show, along with Joe Dombrowski, and coming up with storyline ideas. And that's something that I never wanted to bring to light, because I was smart enough to know that as a young kid in the wrestling industry, when you walk up to a guy who's been in the business 10, 12, 15 years, and you've been in the business too, and you're trying to dictate what they're going to be doing in a storyline or what their promo is going to sound like, you're probably going to get a lot of heat for that. And so I kind of I stayed in the shadows as far as doing that. And I was smart enough to know that I was learning on the job. So it's kind of always been a thing that I've been doing throughout my course of my wrestling career, is just kind of learning the other aspects of the business. And I'm just very happy. And in a lot of ways, I'm very fulfilled doing the podcast now, in terms of like sitting down with my friends and sitting down with guys that maybe I've been friendly with, but have never had a real in-depth conversation with, and getting to know them better, because there's nothing that makes me happier other than being in the ring than to talk wrestling and to share that passion with other people that are passionate about it. And I think that applies to all aspects of life. Like anything that we do, you might not understand an aspect of something, like, I'm not big into, I can't do anything musically, right? But if I met someone who had a passion for music and was very good at it, and I could see it in their eyes and I can hear it when they talk about it, like, that's contagious. And I feel that's the way I feel about wrestling, and to share that aspect with someone, it's pretty incredible.
Love it. So tell me about, let's talk for a moment here about, you talk about you're in Texas for wrestling, obviously, but also you're doing motivational speaking. Tell me a little bit about, for people that don't know that side of what you're doing there, how that came about, and how you're doing with that these days.
Well, the motivational speaking was sort of something that just fell in the lap of Zach Gallen and I throughout the course of teaming. For those that don't remember Zach Gallen, he was in WWE. And he wrestled with one leg, and he was there for a good 8 months back in 2003. And he is actually the reason why I was inspired to try wrestling. And now, through happenstance and circumstances, over the years, we formed a tag team. And we did one show in particular. I don't remember exactly where it was, but the guy who booked us said, hey, I got you guys booked for a speaking gig before the show, and we're going to give you X amount of dollars, which was way more than we would ever get for wrestling. And so the guy says, you guys have done that before, right? And we said, oh yeah. And then me and Zach privately like, oh crap. Like, we don't, like, we're now going to talk to these kids in school. Like, we don't know what we're doing. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, we just kind of like strategized and like thought about it, and like, what's the story we want to tell to these kids? And it was one of those things where together, much like we do in the ring, where we could have been competing against each other as these two different disabled guys, as a tag team, we realized that the sum of the parts were greater than the individual. And so that was kind of the story we tried to tell, with the two-man speaking gig, whereas the sense of like, Zach didn't realize it because he didn't know me. But when I saw him on TV as a kid, he inspired me to try to be a wrestler. And I became a wrestler. Then when I met Zach, he was very much a dick to me. And little did I know he had a drug problem. So he goes to rehab and he comes out of rehab, and he hears me do some podcasts where I say Zach Allen wasn't the kindest guy to me in the world. Zach reached out to me, and he apologized, and he was trying to get his, I want to say feet, but his foot back underneath him. And and he suggested the idea of the tag team. And it was one of those things where, had it not been for me, in a lot of ways, I inspired Zach to keep going as a wrestler. Mm-hmm. And so those stories sort of intertwine. Like when I needed Zach at the most, he was there for me. And then as I got older, Zach needed me, and I was there for him. And also, I don't drink, I don't smoke. So like on our road trips together, like there's no temptations. So he knew I was a good influence. And so it's something you can't write, and it's something that we could share with kids in schools, that like, hey, like this is the circumstances we faced, and this is how we overcame them. And we just made a good connection with the kids, a good connection with the school. And it was one of those things where we started saying to ourselves, well, maybe we should focus more on that. And Zach kind of pulled the trigger on it as an individual before I did. And he found a speaking group called Cool Speak, based out of New Jersey, I believe. And I started doing some stuff with them over the years, and it's been one of those things where Zach is full-time with Cool Speak. I am not. And so I've been just kind of like carving my own path. And it's one of those things where if I can get an opportunity to work with an organization with Cool Speak, great. But the speaking community and getting speaking engagement when you're first starting out and growing, it's much like it's no different than professional wrestling or being in a band, where it's kind of like making connections and putting yourself out there. And I think the hardest part for me is knowing how much that motivational speakers get paid. It's hard for me to sometimes go to these schools knowing that they're going to pay me what I'm going to get paid. And I think to myself, geez, do I really deserve this? Because in my mind, when I look in the mirror, much like, a lot of people see me as Gregory Iron, the wrestler. When I look in the mirror, I'm not Gregory Iron, the wrestler, or the motivational speaker. I'm just Greg, right? And so I think to myself, what warrants me to be able to deserve this amount of money for wrestling or for speaking to kids for an hour and just sharing my story? And sometimes, I just have to tell myself that, like, I don't want to say I earned it, but like, or I deserved it, but like, I'm worth it, and that's something I try to parlay to all the kids too, young and old. And it's just, sometimes people see us better than we see ourselves. And it's still a growing process every day, especially as an adult at 33. I still face a lot of challenges and a lot of downs, along with the ups on my roller coaster. And so I just try to stay positive and constant. And I have a few gigs lined up, and I just try to keep it constant, man, and not overwhelm myself, because as I said, on top of the speaking, I got the wrestling, I got the podcast, I got my hand, not hands. See what I did there? I got my hand in a lot of different buckets right now. And I'm just enjoying it, just as long as I can stay afloat and just inspire people, whether it be through wrestling or speaking or the podcast. I mean, that's really what it's all about. I get to learn that more and more as I get older, that it's just about sharing your story and keep people going through your experiences.
That's awesome. And those are stories I like to hear about, like how anybody on the indies can kind of invest in themselves like this, be kind of your own small business of a person and do these kinds of things. And for you, I'm seeing kind of we talk about that diversification and everything. And of course, Colt kind of laid that out for us, and everybody gets to kind of make their own path through it. So, well, I do want to talk about the first thing, wrestling, just a tiny bit. I only got one main thing to talk about wrestling that I got questions about, because I'm following your feed, and I saw the most interesting group pop up, and I believe Game Changer Wrestling. if I'm not mistaken, this 440 group. This is you, Gregory, Ricky Shane Page, Atticus Cogar, and Eddie Only. Was the first, like, how the hell did those guys to get together? And the more I'm seeing the images and the videos, it kind of makes more sense.
Well, the way it came about was just kind of it was a matter of circumstances for the most part, and it was one of those things where Ricky Shane Page had stolen the Game Changer Wrestling belt from Nick Gage, and it got a lot of publicity, and so Ricky sort of had this idea that he wanted a stable of guys backing him.
Mm-hmm.
And not like a gang type situation, because Nick Gage is all about gang affiliation. And even though we're very hated and we're treated as though we're a gang, I'd like to think that it's a friendship affiliation. And it's one of those things where it's like, we're not out to do illegal activities like someone like Nick Gage who gets cheered. We're out there just to watch each other's back, in a lot of ways, do what we believe is right. And, I think Ricky has really spelled that out with his nickname that he's given himself, the Deathmatch Robin Hood, and it's just one of those things where Atticus Cogar, who was a student of Ricky Shane Page, was booked for a GCW show. Things lined up where I just happened to be the driver for the vehicle that weekend. Nick Gage tried to take back his belt. I was waiting outside in the car as the getaway driver. Ricky and Atticus hopped in the car, and we successfully kept the belt in our possession for another month. And there was a series of vignettes that were filmed with it, and it just kind of started catching fire. And Ricky really decided that he wanted people that were his friends that he could trust backing him, which is why he entrusted in Atticus, which again, he was his student, and that kid has come a long way from when he first started out. When he started, he had a bad attitude, he was going down the wrong path, and then eventually he realized, oh no, I might not go that far in wrestling if I don't start taking the advice of guys who seem to legitimately care about me. And when I say that, guys like me, guys like Ricky, who would spend time with him in school when he was training at the Roaring Elbow. And then Eddie Only comes into play because he was another student of Ricky Shane Page, and he's a guy who's been making buzz for himself over the past couple years, and he's doing a lot more of the death matches, and he's really made a name for himself in the production in AIW, and has got some buzz behind him. And two, when I first met him, I immediately had a connection with him based on mutual friends through Johnny Gargano's family and Eddie Only's family, and growing up in the same neighborhood. So it's really one of those situations where, again, it all comes down to friendship and knowing that we have each other's back. And we were recently talking about this on a road trip home. The tension that has been in the air at these GCW shows is unlike anything that I've ever felt in 14 years of wrestling. I mean, and it sounds super generic to say that, but like, you could really cut the tension with a knife. And there's been fans that they're throwing middle fingers in our faces, and they're like trying to push us around and stuff. It's funny. They won't put their hands on Ricky for some reason, but they'll try to come at Eddie or Atticus or myself. So much so that there's a different feeling in the air, like almost, I don't want to say scary, but like it feels like something could go down at any moment. And in fact, just this past Saturday in Texas, there was a fan while I was at ringside while Ricky was wrestling, got right in my face and put his middle finger in my face and pushed me. And I pushed him a couple times. And I said some very explicit things to him, and he kept getting up, and I pushed him again. And it was getting to the point where, had I punched him in the face, I don't think anyone would have blinked. But there was a part of me that while I wanted to punch him in the face and I wanted to show him you don't put your hands on the performers, I knew that was going to take away from what was happening in the ring. And so just the fact that in 2020 there is a group of guys that can rile up a crowd and kind of evoke that kind of emotion to where we're blurring the lines between good and bad, reality and fiction. I think it's something special. And I guess that just goes to show, the level of following Nick Gage has, that's really inspiring this, uprise of violence. I mean, I don't really respect it, and I don't get it because I grew up with convicts my whole life as parents, and I don't think they're good people. So the fact that someone like Nick Gage can get cheered and admired for all the justly things that he's done, and then he comes back to wrestling as if wrestling owes him something, like good guys like myself and Ricky owe him something. Like, I don't get it, but that's what we're dealing with. So
awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing what's going on there with you guys. So again, to mix it up a little bit, because it's been kind of the theme of this episode, I want to ask you, what's the best and the worst thing about podcasting for you so far? You're approaching 10 episodes, is that right? Where are we at right now?
Oh boy, today episode 18 came out, so
18.
Pretty deep in the game at this point.
Excellent. So what is the best and worst thing about podcasting for you right now?
Like I said, I think the best part about it is interacting with my friends and telling these stories that I've never gotten to tell in any form of audio and video ever. To be able to show my side as a human being, I think, in a lot of ways. And I mean, the worst part is, even though they're my friends, sometimes it's like bugging people. I mean, I don't want to use the term bugging, but I feel like sometimes, with the overabundance of podcasts in the world, sometimes, I mean, I've been on the other end. Like, there's people that reach out to me with poor grammar or poor English skills in general, with 5 followers on Facebook that want me to do their podcast. And then they say, well, it's only going to be 90 minutes. And I think to myself, like, what's the benefit for me? Like, there's been guys over the years where I think, I don't think it's out of the realm of reason. Like a kid or an adult will reach out to me and they'll say, will you do my podcast? And I look at their following and it isn't much. And I say to them, hey, if you buy a shirt off Pro Wrestling Tees, I'll do the podcast. And then they fire back at me, wow, can't believe you would talk to me that way. I can't believe, like, I'm trying to give you exposure. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, let's see. Again, you have like 5 followers and your profile pic is that of an egg. I mean, like, who's really getting the exposure here? So it's like, I'm more than willing to help someone out within reason. But in general, because anyone can do them, I think podcasts got kind of a bad name. So sometimes I feel weird approaching my friends and being like, hey, do you want a podcast with me? Knowing that it's in longer form and knowing that we might talk for an hour. Sometimes not only on top of that, do I feel like I'm bugging them, but like then you have to find the time at a show or before a show and hope that you find a quiet area. And for the most part, I've been lucking out. And I've had no problems getting anyone to do it. But I think part of my problem, too, is, I like doing the podcast in person. I feel like, some guys are like, let's just do it over the phone. And like, there's a level of personability that is lost when you do it on the phone. And I don't mind Skype right now, but I just feel like when you're in person, there's a different form of interaction. I feel like had I done the podcast with Stone Cold Steve Austin over the phone, I wouldn't have got the same sort of genuine reactions out of him. And there was something that kind of motivated me in that moment. Like, going into the podcast with Stone Cold, I thought to myself, if I say one thing that Stone Cold Steve Austin agrees with as far as like wrestling psychology or timing or match structure, or I say something that makes him laugh once, like, that's a victory. And there were so many times that I made him genuinely laugh. There were so many times that we agreed on things. And I'm thinking, again, I'm just Greg Smith from Cleveland, Ohio. I don't see myself as an equal Gregory Iron, but I guess in a lot of ways Steve did. And so that experience gave me confidence, and it made the conversation better, I think, for the listener. And that's what I find, that's what I want to do with my podcast. Like, I don't want to have some disingenuous conversation over the phone. Like, I want to meet up. I want to talk for a little bit. I want to share a drink or two and talk about life and wrestling,
Absolutely. So I know we gotta let you out of here. I know it's Wednesday night. That means there's wrestling, because there's wrestling every damn night. I'm not gonna ask you to tell us which team you're picking to watch tonight. But thank you so much for and one of these days we will have to get you in the studio. We of course, distance and everything, because I share that philosophy for sure.
Yeah, no, I would love to do it in studio, man. And this has been a pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. So once again, give me the rundown. Where can people check out the podcast, or what's going on with you?
Basically, you can find the podcast on iTunes and all major podcast downloadable site thingamabobs. I think that's the technical term.
Yeah, that works.
Again, still working out the whole podcasting thing. I've actually recently started editing myself, and so it's a growing thing for me. But it's available on iTunes, anywhere you download podcasts. Every Wednesday it drops. Sometimes I drop it a couple hours early, but if you subscribe to the podcast, you'll get it as soon as possible. And I've been putting a lot of additional content on a Patreon that I just launched at patreon.com/Iron on Wrestling, where I'm doing bonus episodes, like complete 1-hour episodes, usually at the very least. And some of the previously released episodes, there's bonus content, like additional 15, 20, 30 minutes sometimes that you're not going to hear on the free download on Wednesday. And on top of all that, you can find me on Facebook. Just search Gregory Iron, Twitter at Gregory Iron, Instagram at Gregory_Iron. And of course, you can buy t-shirts at ProWrestlingTees.com/Gregory Iron. And if you want to book me for wrestling or motivational speaking, just go to my website, Gregory-Iron.com.
I tell you what, the supplemental content that you've been doing has been great. I think I was bugging you, asking when the Family Guy induction ceremony was going up at one point. You mentioned something. I was just catching up with the Veda Scott episode, and you mentioned the fabled jail show that I've heard tale of for years in the circles, and that there may be footage existing out there. I think that was a Patreon you were cheesing, and you may get me for that one.
Yeah. Once I find that footage, I know I have it. I would definitely love to put it on Patreon. I mean, it's nothing like it's not super cool. It's one shot, but it's in a prison, and it was something we're not supposed to have on video. But that's one thing that I regret looking back on. It's nice to have those memories of the prison shows that we did. Like we basically did a tour of prisons in, I believe, 2010 and 2011 as wrestlers, which is kind of unheard of. Like, I don't know of any other wrestlers that have done something like this. And we weren't allowed to take pictures. There was not allowed to be a lot of video. And also in 2010, even if we did have our phones, the cameras weren't as good back then. So I don't even know what the quality of the photos would look like. Yeah, it was quite the experience. And there would be these moments where you'd be on the top rope, and the way these prisoners were reacting was like you would feel like you were at like a tribute to the troops, but then you'd have this moment where like, well, there's a child molester, there's a rapist, there's a murderer, and then you kind of sinks in that like this is a pretty actually scary situation. So yeah, if I could find that footage, I'm definitely going to put it on the Patreon for sure.
Looking forward. I'm hoping that does pop up. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and looking forward to when we cross paths again out there on the road.
Thank you so much, Mike.
All right, thanks a lot again. Go check him out, and of course, he did mention always pimp those ratings. Please rate him on the iTunes. I just dropped the 5-star on my iTunes app, podcast app on Apple here, which lied to me how many episodes were out because it's been doing that to me lately. But I know it's been a while. But go check that out, and please subscribe to this show, the Indy Mayhem Show, on your favorite podcast app, or the Wrestling Mayhem Show super feed to get everything wrestling that we're doing in the podcast form. A lot of stuff throughout the week here, at least 3 episodes most weeks, plus these interviews. So thank you so much. Please support independent wrestling and support independent wrestlers in podcasts.
This show is a member of the Sorgatron Media Podcast Network. Find out more at sorgatronmedia.com.